G'day, it's Mark, and welcome back to the channel. And in this episode, we look at the VT Commodore. The VT Commodore was produced from August 1997 to October 2000, and it was built in the Adelaide plant in South Australia. It was the first iteration of the third generation of the Holden Commodore, and it was the last model to be powered by a locally made 5-litre V8 engine. Body styles included a 4-door sedan and a 5-door station wagon. Engine choices included a 3.8-litre Ecotec V6, a supercharged 3.8-litre Ecotec V6, a 5-litre Holden V8, and a 5.7-litre Gen 3 V8, which arrived in the Series 2 models. Transmissions were the 4-speed GM 4L60E, the Getrag 265-speed manual, and later the 6-speed T56 manual. At launch, the VT represented the largest development that Holden had undertaken to date. It was certainly a much larger car than the previous generation VS, and more closely aligned in size to the Ford Falcon. The car was very well received, winning Wheels Car of the Year on launch in 1997. That was the 4th time that a Commodore had won the Wheels Car of the Year. It also came up against the Ford Falcon AU, which had, I guess, been rejected by a lot of traditional Ford customers. Check out my AU comprehensive Falcon history in the Auto History series to learn more about the AU. And it cemented Holden's position as the #1 manufacturer in the Australian market for some time. Overall dimensions of the VT Commodore, being a larger car, were length 4,882 millimetres to 5,040 millimetres, which is 192.2 inches to 198.4 inches. A width of 1,824 millimetres or 71.8 inches. And a wheelbase in the sedan of 2,788 millimetres or 109.8 inches, or in the wagon 2,938 millimetres or 115.7 inches. The car was certainly heavier, and that could also be felt in the drivability of the standard 6-cylinder, coming in at 1,551 kilograms up to 1,702 kilograms, which is 3,419 pounds to 3,752 pounds. So a much bigger car. As with previous Commodores, Holden took inspiration from the Opel in Germany as a donor car platform, the Amiga, and then they widened the car and adapted it to, I guess, suit the mechanical specifications that would be ideal for Australian conditions, including the 3.8 V6 and at launch the Holden V8. As I said, this was the largest Holden investment to date, with a development program of over 600 million Australian dollars. The car featured many a first for an Australian-built car, with more advanced electronic systems, improved dynamics, and also improved crash safety. It also had a 30% stiffer body structure than the VS series. With its rounded styling, the car presented very well, a very attractive package, modern interiors, modern exterior styling, a 63-degree rake for the front windscreen. The rear decor on even the base executive gave it quite an upmarket appeal, as did the interior. And this was in stark contrast to the quite controversially styled AU Falcon. Part of the investment in the new VT included a $275 million upgrade to the Elizabeth, South Australia plant, and that saw a 43% increase in the use of robots to a total of 130. Also a more efficient pressing process with 59 presses instead of 104, and also welding that saw the main spot welds done in 101 seconds, reducing the VT's final assembly time by 2.5 hours, which is substantial considering that's on every single car. There was a lot of interest from Holden's US parent company as part of the development process. And in fact, the Americans did play a role in the development of the vehicle. There was interest in incorporating a left-hand drive variant into the Buick lineup in the United States. And that's why there were a number of engineers that were sent over to Australia with their families to be part of that process. And Holden was provided additional funds that were necessary to make the changes to suit the American market. A prototype was also unveiled to the American public in 1995, and this was known as the Buick XP2000 concept car. And the styling of that concept car formed the basis of the VT project. And it was known internally as Project 127. The plans for an American variant, though, were abandoned relatively early, around 1994. So Holden made the most of the situation by exporting left-hand drive versions of the VT to places like Indochina, the Middle East, and also South America, such as markets like Brazil, where it was sold as the Chevrolet Amiga. In the Middle East, it was sold as the Chevrolet Lumina. The base engine was the 3.8 Ecotec V6 that Holden had originally launched in the Commodore VS Series 2. Check that episode out for more information. And it remained largely unchanged, apart from new exhaust manifolds and also the latest Bosch EV6 fuel injection system. The 5-litre V8 came in for some additional development, around $2 million, where they extracted another 10 kilowatts of power and 10 newton meters of torque over the previous model. There's also the continued availability of an XX1 option, which was the HSV engine, available on Holden V8s. Supercharged 6 also came in for some minor upgrades. It now generated 171 kilowatts or 229 horsepower. That was due to a new engine management system with individual cylinder knock sensor controls. The fuel tank capacity was also increased to 75 litres, and that was up 12 litres for the sedan and 7 for the Wagon compared to the previous VS series. But it was down 5 litres compared to that of the previous V8 range. The fuel tank was mounted ahead of the spare wheel floor cavity at the rear, and that was no doubt in anticipation of US rear crash standards. As I said before, the car was quite a bit heavier, so performance and fuel efficiency were compromised by the heavier body, which weighed around 166 to 195 kilograms more, which is 366 to 430 pounds more over the VS due to its larger size. And I remember being part of a program because I had started in product planning at this stage. The VT car was already designed. By the time I joined Holden for product planning, I got involved in the limited edition models, which I'll go into shortly, colours and trims, sign off of final minor details and equipment levels, alloy wheel options, hubcaps, things like that. It was quite markedly bigger than a VS. So, for example, if you look at the overall length, it was nearly an inch longer. It was up 23 millimeters in length. It was at 2.4 inches in width, 1.9 inches in height, and 2.2 inches in wheelbase. So it was quite a big difference compared to the previous model. Also, the track was a lot wider, and this is something that I really noticed. It was 3.1 inches and 3.6 inches front to rear, respectively. And I remember driving as part of the development program before the cars were launched. As I said, I was in product planning. And I think Holden wanted to advertise, it had been driven X million kilometres as part of the development testing. So I remember we drove early prototypes late at night out of Fisherman's Bend, and the cars were all disguised with, front and rear, and they were all camouflage. It was kind of very exciting, driving out in about 15 or so VT Commodores, just as everyone was sort of timing to go home, around 6 o'clock, 6:30 at night. We started driving out of Fisherman's Bend and went for some long drives into, Yarra Valley and those sorts of areas to get the mileage up and just write some general comments on a report. I had to do an evaluation of what you thought of the car. And even though I'd worked for Holden for about 9 years, I always liked Falcons as well. I wasn't one-eyed. I still am not. So I actually said in my review, I liked the way the car drove. It drove more like a Falcon. And some people raised their eyebrows. And I said, well, the reason I say that is because the car has a much wider track. It's physically a bigger car and a softer car in the ride. And it was more similar to, at that stage, I would have been driving EL Falcons, that type of model. And so I saw it as a positive, though. I said, it's a really good thing. The car's very comfortable, very nice to drive. You could notice, though, that it was down a little on power and acceleration because of the extra weight. The boot capacity in the sedan was up 475 litres, which is massive, so 16.8 cubic feet. So that's quite a big change. The wagon I really liked. Holden had always had sort of smaller wagons. You'd have to go back to probably, HK to HG series, where Ford and Holden had similar sized wagons. After that, Ford always had much bigger station wagons, and they captured a much larger share of the market in the wagon stakes than what Holden did. Whereas with the VT Commodore, it was a much larger wagon. It had independent rear suspension. That's something I should mention as well. That was standard on all the cars. And it really improved the way the wagon drove and rode. There were some issues, though, if you loaded the car up excessively with inner tyre wear, where the rear suspension, because of the camber of the wheels, they kind of bowed out a little bit, and that created some inner tyre wear. But that was more felt in the HSV models, which I'll get to a little later. But the wagon was substantially bigger than the VS. It was, 5.5 inches longer, substantially wider as well, longer wheelbase. And, Holden were very much, with the development of this car, in terms of interior packaging, not just the wagon, but sedans as well, really targeting the Falcon. They were very acutely aware of Falcon sales. Falcon was very successful in the fleet market. And just that bigger car, bigger interior space, they wanted to make sure that the VT Commodore was every bit as large inside as what a Falcon was. And they certainly achieved that with the VT Commodore series. As I said, the VT heralded the launch of the independent rear suspension across the whole range. And it was originally carried over directly from the European suspension design, but it had the removal of the toe control link, which had been standard equipment on the Amiga since 1987. And so because of that, it was prone for that camber angle, which under heavy loads, as I said, wore the tyres excessively, and that was an issue. And which ended up, HSV had to re-add the toe link control on the GTS 300 model as part of its Series 2. And there was certainly work done by Holden to try and improve that, because it was an issue. And as I said, with HSV with the softer compound tyres, it was quite noticeable, and owners did complain about that. In terms of steering, the system was a Bishop variable ratio design, and the car had a more neutral handling characteristic than probably the previous VS. The wider track certainly helped. The Calais had a speed-sensitive variotronic mechanism, and that did get some criticism for reduced feel. There's also new features on the Commodore, such as things like traction control, and that was standard on the Commodore Acclaim and the Calais and optional on the other models. Security systems were also upgraded as part of the anti-theft devices that were fitted to the cars. Also, all the heating, ventilation and air conditioning components were all new. There was only a very small number of carryover parts. I think the column stalks were probably something that they carried over. Outside of that, it was all pretty well new. And also, there was a lot of work done around safety. Driver's side airbag was standard across all models, along with a passenger airbag, optional on other models, standard on the Acclaim, and it was also standard on the Calais. In terms of engine output, the Ecotec 6-cylinder V6 put out 147 kilowatts, which is 197 horsepower, 304 newton meters of torque, or 224 foot-pounds. The supercharged engine put out 171, as I mentioned before, 229 horsepower, with 375 newton meters of torque, or 277 foot-pounds. Quite a handy torque improvement over the standard engine. The Holden V8 5-litre had 179 kilowatts of power, 240 horsepower, and 400 newton meters of torque, or 295 foot-pounds. There's also an HSV enhanced engine, as I mentioned before, XX1, and that put the power up to 195 kilowatts or 261 horsepower and 430 newton meters of torque or 317 foot-pounds. Later, and I'll get into it in a bit more detail, at Series 2, the Holden engine was dropped. I remember in product planning, because I was like, I really love my V8s. I had to do a model range forecast for the new Gen 3 engine, the 5.7, and I had to then do the run out spreadsheet for all the different models for production, forecasting out the run out of the Holden V8. So I had to go right through it in great detail, month of production, models, manual, automatic, Bellinas, executives, SS, Calais, whatever, standard cars. And you have to forecast out what the volume was going to be, and then you had to show what the increased volume was going to be with the Gen 3 engine. So I did that, and I was quite optimistic. I thought a 5.7, 350 Chev engine, aluminium block, would be very well received in the market. So I certainly ramped up the volumes. But as it turned out, even my optimistic volumes were not as high as what actually eventuated in sales, because the Gen 3 was very, very popular. So the VT series was officially announced on the 26th of August 1997 and went on sale on the 5th of September. And there was a Series 2 upgrade, and that was launched on the 1st of June 1999, and that sold until October 2000. And the launch of the Series 2, the main news there was the release of the Gen 3 V8 engine. So the range consisted of the Commodore Executive, which was your sort of entry-level fleet car. V6 manual sedan went for $29,760 and $31,600 for a Wagon. You could get an optional automatic and also an optional V8. The Commodore Acclaim, which was your family safety package model, that sold for $33,980 for a sedan and $34,960 for a Wagon. Then there was the Commodore S, which is like your entry-level sporty package, V6 only. That was $34,810, sedan only. You could order a supercharged engine in the S pack as well. And that took the car from 0 to 100 in 6.7 seconds. Not too bad. Then there was the Commodore SS, which was the high-end sports V8 package, and that sold for $44,160, sedan only, and that was available with automatic as an option. Or you could actually get a V6 supercharged, and that was for a race series. Sales of a supercharged SS 6 were very, very low. Then there was the Bellina, which was your entry-level luxury car. The V6 automatic, one of those, was $39,800 for a sedan, or $42,600 for a Wagon, and that had an optional V8 as well. Then there was the Calais, which was the top of the line luxury model. The V6 Auto was $48,760, sedan only, with the availability of either the V8 or a supercharged engine. Even the base Executives was nicely equipped with independent rear suspension, driver's airbag, seatbelt pre-tensioners, had an electric seat height adjuster and tilt adjuster, front seat lumbar support, trip computer with a 6-function single digital window on all models. The Bellina and the Calais came up with a higher level trip computer, which had 12 functions and 3 digital windows. The passenger airbag was available across the range as an option for $510, but it was standard, as I said before, on the Acclaim and also on the Calais. ABS was available across the range. It was optional on the Executive. Traction control was standard on the Acclaim and the Calais, but optional on the rest of the range for $510. A nice feature on the early VTs were the word Holden, which was on the rear decor panel, and the font of that was sort of taken from the earlier Holden series. And equally on the Calais, quite a nice badge on the side. The font there, again, was inspired by the older Holden models from the 50s and 60s. I worked when I was at Product Planning with Mike Simcoe and Richard Falazzo and other designers, and it was pretty exciting being there, seeing the cars in clay. I remember the first time I saw the VT, I was very impressed. I particularly liked the Wagon, how big it was. I thought that'll sell really well. And yeah, it was a great time to be at Holden. Certainly Holden was on a roll and really investing and hitting its stride again. I think that was how I'd probably put it. Some of the colours that were available: Heron White, Rubens Mica, which is like a burgundy, Capricorn Mica, Raven Mica, which is like a dark bluey, black blue sort of colour, Orion Frost, which was a silver, Valencia Mica, Tundra Mica, Botanica, which is like a sort of a turquoisey colour, Granada Mica, Morocco Sand Frost, and Bermuda Mica. There were a number of special limited editions available. Before I go into that, though, I might just mention, we were on the subject of colour. I remember we launched, the hero colour was Tiger, which was like a metallic orange. And I remember I had to present in product planning to Kevin Whale, who was the marketing director. And I really liked the Tiger Mica, and the design team liked it as well. That was a hero colour, as I said. And he was like, oh, I don't know about this. You know, I remember being at Holden at HQ, he said, and I remember having purple cars in stock that were hard to shift. And so I had a few different shades of what the colour could be. And the Tiger was the more orangey, sort of brighter, out there colour. Then there were some other more kind of gold colours. He said, oh, what about some of these? I said, well, that ceases to become a hero colour. You know, the whole idea is to have a wow factor. If you start dialing it down, no one's going to buy it because it just becomes sort of a gold. In fact, one thing I can lay claim to fame on my time at Holden is I killed beige. I always knew when I was in Holden regional offices, wholesaling cars to dealers, that, you know, beige was always a car that was hard to shift. When you're running out models, inevitably beige and some of these other colours were the ones that were remaining in stock and hard to sell. I thought, I'm going to kill beige off. Why have a colour like that? Equally with alloy wheels and hubcaps, I was just really careful I always had to select. The designers did the wheel designs, then I had to sort of select from those as to which models we were going to apply them to. And part of the briefing as well, I said, you know, make the hubcaps look like alloy wheels. Don't just do these boring flat hubcaps. At least make the base car look good, you know. So that way, when you go to sell the car, you know, even if it's a fleet car, you got to sell it at retail. You know, if you don't have beige and you've got some nice colours, you've got even the base model has, you know, nice hubcaps and things, it just becomes a much more appealing car at retail and a better used car and easier to sell. And I think those sort of things were quite important. And that came from, I guess, all my years working at Holden and Mitsubishi, sort of with dealers, you know, hundreds of dealers, and knowing, you know, how to allocate cars and wholesale cars and knowing what really sold and what customers wanted. And that was, I guess, something that I brought to that job. But in the end, Kevin Whale relented. He said, well, you know the market probably better than anyone. So, you know, if you think Tiger's going to sell, then fine, go ahead. And I said, look, it's not going to be big volume, but it will be a great hero colour. And I think it was, you know, if you think of the Tiger SSs, it was available on other cars. I remember, you know, seeing a Bellina Wagon in Tiger Mica. Probably not the best colour for something like that. It was also made available on the later VU Ute series, and I'll get into that as a separate series because I was very much involved in that whole program. We also did some limited editions. There was the 1998 50th anniversary cars, so I did work on those. There was a Sedan and Wagon 50th anniversary. The 50th anniversary Calais. I remember we looked at a very light shale interior, and which I thought looked really nice, and a gold sort of exterior, or a very light pale gold with sort of colour-keyed wheel, painted out sort of wheel inset matching colours as well. And I remember my boss at the time, Pat Fay, was concerned about just the marks and cleanliness, ability to keep the interior clean. So I remember I went to a Lexus dealer in the city in Melbourne, not far, you know, probably 20 minutes from the Fisherman's Bed head office. I just spoke to some of the salesmen there and just said, look, you know, how do you go with these? Because Lexus had a very similar, very light shale leather interior. I said, how do you go with customers in terms of cleanliness and trading in? And they were like, no, it's fine. We don't have any problem with that. So I reported that back and basically were able to then go ahead with that Calais. I thought that was a particularly nice car. There was also the 1999 Commodore Equip, was a value marketing package, like a vacationer type thing. And then also, because Holden was sponsoring the Olympic Games, there was a 1999 to 2000 Commodore Olympic edition. And then there was a 2000 model Calais International. Series 2 was upgraded in 1st of June 99. And the big news there was the Ecotech V6 remained structurally unchanged, but it did receive an updated tune, which made the car slightly faster than the original, because that was an issue, I guess, around the weight of the car. Should also mention a few things just on the early cars. The rear decor looked terrific, but it used to leak. When you open the boot, it used to leak water into the boot, and it was also very expensive. So when I was working on VX Commodore, and I'll get into that in a separate episode, there was a lot of work that was done around that rear decor to, one, stop the leak, two, get the cost out of it. But also, Holden was keen to get costs out of the car and also keen to reduce weight. So they sent me to Elizabeth with some of the other product planning committee people, and we literally were walking the production line while it was running. So literally walking on the line and down the line as it was running, and looking at every opportunity. Where could we take costs out, or what components could we take out that wouldn't be noticeable to the customer, that would reduce cost and weight? And it was a very good process to go through, just being actually there. I remember, as an example, on the floor, you've got different undulations with the pressings. And so what Holden used to do was make these little foam pieces that would fit into the depressions of the floor so that the carpet was completely flat in the early series cars. But with the underlay, we just determined that wasn't really necessary, and we could take out all those little parts, or most of them, and reduce the cost and also the labour time, and no one would really notice it. I can't remember the other things we took out, but we took out quite a few things. And I remember at the end, I think we took out something like $25 per car piece cost. And when you consider that across the life of the model, that's a huge amount of money that's saved. And also reduced weight a little bit, but not too much, but it did reduce a little bit of weight. But the cost was the main thing. Holden was also, I guess, as part of the development, I remember there were additional welds and engineering supports that were added very late in the model's life before launch to increase body rigidity and structural integrity. And some of these were probably fairly heavy-handed because they were running up against the wire to get the car out by launch. So I know as part of that process that we went through to get weight out and cost out, I had no input into this because I'm not an engineer, but some of the engineers then were able to rework or delete some of those structural enhancements to reduce weight and cost. And I guess because once the car was launched, they had more time to then work on that and then just upgrade it as sort of running changes. So that was also done as well, I remember. But getting back to the Series 2, the availability of the supercharged V6 was no longer available on the SS, because that was part of a racing series and they just didn't really sell anything. And it became optional on a Bellina, but standard on the Calais. You could still get a standard 3.8 as a delete option, as well as the 5-litre Holden V8. That was the big news. As I said, I did all the forecasts to run that out, the Holden engine. And you would think now people would look back and say, oh, I want one of the last of the Holden V8s. But that wasn't the case at all. People wanted the new engine, much more power, like a Chev 350. It's a bit like if you think of a HQ series Holden, Monaro or a Statesman, and you have the 350 version, like that's really the top of the tree. That's the one everyone wants. So all of a sudden with the V8, every V8 then was going to become a 5.7 Gen 3. So there was a lot of excitement around that. And they were actually made in Ontario in Canada at the St. Catharines GM Powertrain factory, the LS1 engine. And I remember, again, in product planning, having another debate with Kevin Whale, and he was very concerned about the power output of the engine. And he said, I'm really worried about like the supercar scare, that we're going to reignite that. And I just said, look, I don't think that's going to happen. And he was very, very worried about it. Or when I say very, very, he was worried about it. He was concerned about it. I'm sure he didn't lose sleep over it, but he just thought, He didn't want to get into that because that was quite a big jump in power to 220 kilowatts. But in order to get to 220 kilowatts, which is 295 horsepower, the engineers had to detune the car to get it down to that level, because in standard format, it actually put out more like 250 kilowatts. Made it super easy for HSV just to, literally put it just a, slightly modified sports exhaust on, and then they had their power output. It was very easy for those guys. And I was sort of arguing with Kevin Whale, but he's obviously the boss, so you can only argue so far. I said, look, all the engineers in America have done all this work to develop this great engine. I said, it's a bit like going to the doctor and asking him to make you sick, to actually make the engine put out less power than what it normally does. But I think we argued it up to 220. I think originally he wanted it to be around 195, 200, maybe 200. With the extra weight and everything, we were able to argue it up to 220, but that still meant it was a detuned version. Cosmetically, there were, models got new wheels and hubcaps and things like that. Some of the badging changed as well. Also, the indicators on the side became clear lenses instead of amber. And the new Calais also had a chrome strip across the boot garnish above the number plate. There's also an extensive HSV range. There was the Manta. Now, in the Series 1 VT, that had the 5-litre 195 kilowatt engine with a 5-speed manual or a 4-speed auto. Same engine as the Club Sport, again, manual or auto, 195 kilowatts. The GTS sedan in the Holden engine had 220 kilowatts, or there was an optional 230 kilowatt version with a 6-speed manual or a 4-speed automatic. The Senator had the 5.7 with a 220 kilowatt or the optional 230 kilowatt, and that was a 4-speed automatic or available with a 5 or 6-speed manual option. Then there was a Senator Signature, again 220 kilowatt or 230 optional. And then there was a Senator Estate Wagon, very few of those were made, that had the 220 kilowatt V8 or an optional 230 kilowatt. And that was only available as a 4-speed auto. There was also a limited run of XU8 models, a bit of a takeoff of XU1. And that was to celebrate the last of the Australian-made 5-litre engines due to the fact they were going to be changed or replaced by that Gen 3 engine. Just another thing on the Gen 3 as it comes to mind, I was also responsible for not the design of the shroud that goes at the cover on the engine, but, putting 5.7, high output V8 or alloy V8, I think it said. I was responsible for sort of like the wording on that. I kind of really want to push that 5.7. Same as on the badges on the side, 5.7 V8, Gen 3 V8. Put that. That's what I wanted on the side of the car. The Middle East cars had a really nice badge, a high output badge, which I thought was really terrific. We probably should have used that one. It was even better. But I really wanted to push that whole V8 performance. And one big mistake, after I left product planning at Holden, my replacement, I know for VY and VZ, when they had V6 and V8 badges on the side of the cars, it's very hard to tell when you looked at it, is that a V6 or a V8? You have to really look at it. And that's really a big mistake because, V8 customers, when you buy a V8 and you pay the extra for a V8, you want pretty well everyone to know that you've got the V8. If it's just a simple little V8 badge, that's fine, like they had on the earlier VS series Commodores. But you want to know, compared to a standard 6, you want to know that, they want people to know that they bought the V8. That, apart from looking at, say, a dual exhaust out the back or something like that, the badging is very important as to kind of a bit of a, hey, I've paid the extra money, I'm a V8 customer. There's also a very short-lived XU6 sedan, and that had the 3.8-litre supercharged V6. At Series 2, HSV was able to, it replaced the standard Club Sport, or the whole range really, with the new 5.7 Gen 3 LS1 V8, and it now had 250 kilowatts or 340 horsepower. HSV also exported some cars to the UK. The Series 2 VT Club Sport was rebadged as a GTS for the UK market, and they produced 402 of those. I think 126 of those were automatic and the rest of them were manual. There was also 100 Callaway C4B VT GTSs, Series 2, And then there was a GDSR 15 produced for the UK market. I think styling-wise, the HSV models were quite subtly done. Like, they weren't really in your face. They were very successful. I know the Senator Signature in particular, that looked good. It had the 10-spoke, 17-inch alloy wheels and front fog lights, side skirts. All the HSVs had very nice interiors, particularly when you got into the up-spec Senator models with the leather. You got the really nice seats and everything, and you know the cars do look particularly good. HSV brakes and suspension and so on. So the cars certainly looked the part. I think they came into their own when they got the Gen 3 upgrade. As I mentioned before, Holden also exported the VT Commodore to the Middle East, and they were badged as Chevrolet Lumina, and that began in 1998 and sold as 99 models. And there were 3 trims available: LS, LTZ, and SS, and they were based on the Commodore Executive, Bellina, and SS, respectively, of those models. And a Wagon variant was also available. It was only offered in LS form with a V6. And that was the first Holden to be produced in left-hand drive since the LH Tirana finished production in 1976. In addition, General Motors Brazil also imported the VT as the Chevrolet Omega from October 98 to replace the same model, I guess the Opel Amiga. And the Brazilian model sold as a single specification CD model. That was based on a Holden Calais, and it was powered by the 3.8 Ecotec engine. The VT2 model also came to Brazil in December 1999, and VT Amiga sales ended in 2001 when they were then replaced by the VX. A total of 303,895 VT Commodores were produced, and of these, around 100,000 were sold in the first 22 months leading up to the launch of the VT Series 2 in June 1999. And there were also 33,428 VTs exported. Well, I hope you enjoyed that episode on the Holden VT Commodore. Certainly a landmark car that put Holden on a good path for success for quite a few years to follow. If you enjoyed the episode, please do give it a thumbs up. It really does make a big difference to the channel. Only takes a second and doesn't cost you anything. Also, please be sure to hit that subscribe button so you don't miss out on future episodes. You can also check out the playlist on the Holden Commodore series right back to the VB, and we'll be covering each model. So thanks very much for watching. We'll see you next time. Bye.